Okay, so good morning, everyone. This is the last session of 6 study group sessions, and we're keynoting it with Mark Recken from Confirm It, who is a seasoned marketing executive. He's got over 25 years of experience in the industry. He's old like me, and he drives profits and increases sales through doing everything from deep data analytics all the way through improving client relationships and processes, and then driving that through the culture of the organization. He's got deep experience in herding squirrels, project management and operational support, and he is very achievement and performance oriented. He's worked at firms such as the one he's at today, Confirm It, which pulls all of voice of the customer together, Walker CX in infodynamics on the practitioner side, and he's been able to herd them through to double-digit growth. He's experienced in all the facets, actually, of what we're talking about. He was the one person in that survey who actually said, throw me into anything, coach. I can be the subject matter expert pretty much across all of the different exam blueprints. And because he's a continuous learner and he's taken all the courses from folks like Mike Barnett and others, he's really going to be able to share some tips and techniques around the test as well. So over to you, Mark. And thank you very much. Before we go out, because we may go a little bit over, I also want to thank all of the other subject matter experts, Katie, Heather, the other Mark, because this has been, without them, we wouldn't have been able to do this. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And I got a cheer out there for another Walker alum.
So thank you very much, Valerie. So, coming into this, I am so flattered and humbled by Valerie's nice introduction, and then I'm terrified because I can't possibly live up to all the nice things that she has said. So
yeah, he did it yesterday, so don't listen to him.
Yeah, that could be a statistical outlier, Valerie. We'll see in about the next 40 minutes or so. So thank you so much, everybody, for attending. Thank you for your interest in this. For today, what I'd like to do, I'll just start with some general opening remarks. We'll go into the background on corporate culture and CX. We'll really talk about how, what that means, how it aligns with the other sessions that have been covered in the study group. And then, of course, we'll spend a good chunk of time going through about 12 example questions from the resources that we've been able to pull, and then have any kind of Q&A. So first and foremost, that's me. I'm sparing you the experience of having me on camera this morning. This is as close as you're going to get. The main thing I would point out here is that I've worked with companies like Cisco Systems, Lenovo, a lot of Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies, and the theme, regardless of vertical, has been the same. How do we help build out a vision of CX and really get that into the environment? So let's talk a little bit about the exam itself. Now, this is exactly straight from the CXPA. The customer-centric culture is about 14% of the exam. And what this entails, I'll just read this because I think they do a good job of laying it out. Creating and nurturing a culture through behaviors, practices, and standards that encourages all employees to focus on delivering outstanding customer experiences. And then I won't go into all the tasks that are associated. However, the general theme that I see in the task is how we align the attitudes and behaviors of employees to the customer-focused approach so that we can coalesce those things together. Now, let's talk a bit about corporate culture. What does it mean? Well, if we go to Investopedia, they offer this definition. I'm not going to read this because there's a lot of words. However, I would point out a number of things. The beliefs and behaviors that determine how companies, employee, and management interact. It's implied, often implied, not expressly defined, develops organically over time, reflected in things like dress code, business hours, office setup, client satisfaction. So this is kind of the, how do we do what we do and why do we do it? And how does this relate to CX? Well, again, it takes the elements from the prior 5 sessions, around voice of customer, organization adoption, CX strategy, experience design, metrics and ROI, and it starts to bring all those together. And the objective with the corporate culture piece is how do we take those individual disciplines and tools that we've been discussing and use that to weave that into the fabric or the DNA of the organization. Now, why is that important? Well, at Confirm It, we find that there is a path towards CX maturity, and I think undergirding CX maturity is really the idea of how the culture plays out. And we define maturity in 5 dimensions. First of all, it starts with a vision. Where are we going? Why are we doing this? What does success look like? How are we going to prioritize? This is generally top-down driven, and it is imperative because it gives us the roadmap for where we want to go, what we aspire to be. Once we do that, then we focus in a little more tactically on the design side, which is all about, do we have the right processes, infrastructure? This is where VOC tends to live, for example. So around data capture, integration, analysis, reporting, and alerts. That's important because those are the tools that often drive engagement. And engagement is all about having the right team on board. And you'll notice here that we talked about engagement from 2 dimensions, not only from a top-down approach, but also from a bottom-up approach. So invariably, what typically happens is we start with a top-down perspective and enlightened executives that tend to reinforce the CX vision. And again, what we're trying to do is to create this cycle where we implement and we communicate that so effectively that then it starts to bubble up from the ground up through the organization. So it's both leadership and frontline and empowering them. And that's a very important word, empower, to make certain that they feel enabled and capable of acting on behalf of the customer. Action is really what it's all about. Do we know what we need to do? So if you're doing, for example, a voice of customer study and you're doing that to get a net promoter score to put on a dashboard somewhere, you're really missing the point. That's an accounting exercise. It's also a cost. And what do we know about costs over time? Costs over time are eliminated. If you're doing this in a way that is leading to action, it becomes an investment which has a return. Investments tend to persist to the extent they have an acceptable return. And action is really focused at 2 levels. Local action, think of this as kind of account level strategies for when we get feedback from individuals within an individual account or an individual segment. And then there's strategic change. That's more macro level changes that will have the greatest good on the greatest number of customers. Bain calls the local action piece the inner loop. They refer to the strategic change piece as the outer loop. Both are critically important. And you take action and you build it around this framework so that ultimately this all comes together for value, which is defined as impact on the bottom line. If we are not articulating the value, we are missing the point. In fact, at the end of last year, Harley Manning at Forrester had a blog in which he said, and it was, not necessarily controversial, but certainly alarming, that he predicted in 2020 up to 1 in 4 CX professionals would lose their jobs. And he said the root cause of that was we had not done an adequate enough job of articulating the value and the ROI of CX. He said, and paradoxically, at the same time, the demand for chief customer officers and senior level customer experience professionals has never been higher. So what explains that? Well, it's all about being able to define, articulate, and deliver on the ROI. Now, why is that important? And one of the things I've learned throughout my career is if you think about this from a competitive advantage perspective, at the end of the day, you think about kind of the traditional sources of competitive advantage. You might have intellectual property, or you might have a really unique product. or service that you offer the organization or the market. Over time, intellectual property rights subside, patents expire, disruptors come about in the marketplace and can, make what was innovative yesterday old news today. Think about what Uber has done in the transportation space. So those are not sustainable sources of competitive advantage. We say, well, what about, how we do our know-how and how we do what we do? Well, your competitors probably buy laptops from the same providers that you do. They're probably hiring from the same schools that you do. So again, there's a lot of sameness there. And so what is the ultimate source of competitive advantage? I would argue it's the culture, because that's something that is not easily replicated. And particularly a customer-centric culture is not only not easily replicated, but because it puts customers at the center of the strategy, it becomes eminently valuable from a business perspective. So what's it mean to have a CX culture? So let's just kind of look at this from a bit of a different perspective. Leading by example. Not only has to start at the top, but anywhere where you have a leadership role, making certain that people are leading by example. There is no organization on the planet that offers products or services that would not say the customers are not, nobody would say, nah, we don't really care about customers. Everybody says customers are very important to us. We love customers. We're very customer focused. But we can all think individually of companies where you say, yeah, you say that, but what I experience is markedly different. And oftentimes what that comes down to is the leadership behaviors that employees see, not only at the top level, but also their managers. So anywhere where you have a leadership perspective, you have to be leading by example. That starts with having a defined vision and building that vision around the brand and around the customer, and constantly communicating that. I often hear when I'm talking to clients, my gosh, I have said the same spiel about our customer experience program and our customer focus so many times. If I have to say it one more time, my head's going to explode. I just feel like I'm a broken record. And my guidance to them, based on my experience, is if you're feeling that way, you might be off to a good start. Because just because you understand it and you know it, don't presume that everybody else gets it. And so you cannot communicate enough. It's important to know and engage both customers and employees. And so this is interesting because we're hearing a lot more and more about the linkage between employee experience and customer experience, and understanding kind of this virtuous cycle that emerges. And if we take care, if we create a great environment for our employees, they will create a great environment for the customers. They'll spend more with us, and it just becomes this virtuous cycle. And I've seen lots of evidence for that, quantitatively and just qualitatively, based on organizations that I look at. But to do that, you have to understand what motivates both customers and employees, and you have to understand expectations and needs and be delivering to that. Next is about having the right kinds of incentives. And incentives is always a tricky topic, because when we hear incentives, we invariably hear money. We hear spiffs. We hear, different kinds of more monetarily oriented incentives, particularly when we're talking about employee engagement. The reality is there's a whole breadth of incentives, and sometimes the incentives that we think of can be counterproductive to what we're trying to do. Focusing on empower employees to take action. Again, it's not enough to talk about this. You have to teach your employees what being customer-centric means. That's not a one-off thing that you do in an onboarding and then you never revisit it again, but empowering them so that when the boss isn't there, or when the moment of truth occurs and there's that intersection point with an interaction with a customer, that these employees know what is the right thing to do and that they're empowered to do it. And then finally, looking outside in to bring the customer's perspective. This is the notion of customer journey mapping, is really understanding how the customer proceeds through the cycle and the inevitable barriers, enablers that exist. So these are, I would say a number of the large items that you need to have a CX culture. Now, why is that important? Well, another thing that we've observed is there tends to be 3 stages in the evolution of successful CX programs. And it really starts with what we call getting established. When you're getting established, your focus is generally managers in the front line. It's about getting the basics right. The classic scenario here is a client will come to us and they'll say, we want to do a voice of customer study, or we want to do, we want to do some customer listening. And so that's all about using voice of customer, voice of business, partner, supplier to get the basics right with an emphasis on closing the loop. From a business impact perspective, that's all about customer retention and, frankly, understanding the customer reality. This is also where you might layer in journey mapping to understand what that customer experience is. A lot of companies, I would argue most companies, are doing some variation of what we're talking about in the getting established, but fewer move to the wider perspective arena. In the wider perspective arena, the focus tends to migrate from managers in the front line to senior leaders and a change team, the change agents in the organization, because the focus is really now on how do we make customer-centric decisions and use the feedback from customers to improve not only the experience, but processes, which can not only benefit customers, but can also benefit us from a cost of operation perspective. How we do that is we start to overlay on top of what we're doing VOC through the eyes of the employee, as well as the voice of the market, more externally oriented sources of perspective. And the business impact, the outcomes that we're looking for, product and service improvement, and team engagement. Remember, we talked about engagement in that CX maturity model. So most are doing getting established, fewer are doing wider perspective, and fewer yet get to the level that we tend to refer to as embedded CX. A bit paradoxically, we start to then, we focus back on managers in the front line, because again, once you have the buy-in and the feedback from the senior leaders, you want this to start to bubble up from the bottom up. And this is all about behavior change and customer centricity. To do that, we start to integrate with other platforms. Certainly, other indicators of employee engagement that we might have at our disposal, integrating with business outcomes, financial data, operational data. And the outcome that we're looking for here is sustainable business growth. So in the first stage, we're looking at retention. That's kind of keeping what you've got. At this stage, we're really looking to how to use this to jettison our growth trajectory. And the outcome is a true customer-centric culture. And I point this out because you get here, and what separates this, it's all about whether or not you can implement that CX-oriented culture. You can do a lot of the other tactical stuff, but if you don't have the culture, it's not going to be sustainable. Before I jump into this, I'll stop and see if there are any questions. I don't have let me just see if there's anything in the chat window. I'm not able to pull up the chat window. Valerie, are any questions coming through? Or
nope, I'm just hearing lots of preach it, preach it.
Oh boy, oh boy. So let's go in, let's talk about the exam itself. So we talked a bit about the culture. Let's talk about how this manifests itself in the exam. There are a lot of employee-related concepts that relate to this culture piece. And so I wanted to talk just about a few of the items that I found particularly valuable to be well-versed in taking the exam. The first, and this sounds so intuitive, but it almost sounds like a trick question if it comes up on the exam, is the easiest way to become a customer-focused organization is to hire customer-oriented employees. This is kind of the ultimate in make versus buy, right? Why not hire people who have customer orientations if we're trying to become more customer-centric? Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that the CX thing isn't something that just sits in the marketing organization or the quality organization, or it has to transcend to even have roots and feelers into the HR realm. So we want to make certain that we're looking for people who are inherently customer focused. uh, thinking about the linkage between the employee experience and the customer experience. And this, of course, gets into using voice of customer and voice of employee results to understand what will drive that CX-oriented culture. The idea of voice of customer through the employees, using those employees as a valuable resource, which as time and participation from customers becomes more and more of a challenge. Those employees have great insight and data, and it can be a great information source. And more importantly, from a culture perspective, that's one way to engage people in the process. And then this idea of the law of congruent experience. And what this essentially says is that the extent to which an employee can deliver a strong customer experience will be constrained by the experience they're having as employees. So that's a nice way of saying, this virtuous cycle of treat your employees well and they'll treat your customers well results in positive business outcomes. The law of congruent experience. We talked about motivation, and one of the theories that I think really plays in well and could very well be a factor on the exam is Hertzberg's two-factor theory of motivation. And what Hertzberg suggests is that there are two types of issues or factors, as he would call them. Hygiene issues, which are really extrinsic factors like work conditions, salary, a lot of those levers that we kind of tend to think are important. And then what he calls motivators, which are really more intrinsically oriented. Hertzberg says, and there's been a lot of supplemental research, this has been around for about 50 years and still has a lot of legs. Hertzberg would say that hygiene issues, those extrinsic factors, don't really impact satisfaction. It minimizes dissatisfaction. And so he makes the distinction that the opposite of dissatisfaction isn't satisfaction. The opposite of dissatisfaction is not being dissatisfied. It's a bit of a nuance and takes a little while to get your arms around that. But essentially, he's saying that dissatisfaction and satisfaction are two different things. Hygiene issues, work conditions, salary, some of those traditional things that we think of will impact the extent to which an employee might be dissatisfied with their job. So classic example here, and you think about this in the .com era where you had, lots of cool workspaces and, basketball goals and ping pong tables and pinball machines and all this stuff. Those are really what Hertzberg would say are hygiene issues. So those are going to help prevent job dissatisfaction, but they won't create satisfaction. The things that create satisfaction are those intrinsic factors like recognition, achievement, the nature of the work itself, how fulfilling that work is. That doesn't really have any bearing on how cool your desk is or the kind of PC that you get to use. There are different motivators that we should employ. And one of the participants yesterday brought up an extremely valuable point, is that when you're thinking about this, you have to think about this in the context of cultural norms, because in certain areas of the world, certain motivators that would work for us in North America wouldn't, for example, work in Asia Pacific. I worked with a Japanese client one time, and they hated anything that would bring a lot of recognition. They just thought that was, culturally, that was too braggadocious. That was not a part of their culture. And so you need to be sensitive from a cultural perspective about what may work, particularly when you're a part of a large global organization. The next item is the concept of employee engagement is not the same as employee experience. And this is kind of the classic psychological concept of experiences lead to perceptions that foster engagement. So it's kind of the idea of, do emotions come first, or emotions the outcome of some experience? And we would offer that it's the experience that leads to perceptions / emotions that then foster engagement, or conversely, disengagement. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is to design an employee experience that will really kind of light the fire to create an engaged employee and have those folks be so empowered to make decisions that will ensure a high level of customer engagement. So be aware of some of these factors as you prepare for the exam. And then questions around governance also come into play as well. You know, we've talked a lot about top-down leadership, the role that CX teams play, and the role of chief customer officer, be conversant in that. The idea of ongoing training. Again, this idea that this isn't a one and done, you do it in your first week, you read it in the handbook, and then you don't revisit it. Constantly be refreshing that, offer refreshers on what that means and what that means to that individual person's role. And then finally, in the governance process, the idea of cross-functional teams. Invariably, you are going to have to engage with and help influence others outside of your organization. And ultimately, that diversity makes the program much stronger. You want that variety of perspectives because it leads to an optimal solution. And to do that, you have to have skills that will allow you to break down organizational silos by being able to develop and leverage relationships, and then identifying and more importantly, engaging people who are actively involved. And so again, this is kind of how you, Valerie, you said there were comments, you know, preach it, but this is how you kind of spread the gospel, right? You have to teach people and then send them out to continue to share the good word. I will stop and see if there are any questions. Otherwise, we'll go into some example questions, and then I'll conclude with just some kind of observations and some perhaps unsolicited advice as you prepare. Valerie, any questions to address at this point?
I'm not seeing any. It's a very quiet group. Maybe they've been partying for the new year. Okay. Saying, I know this is a question varies. There's a question coming. Hold on.
Okay.
Answer it. Just go ahead and ask the question so that we can put it on the recording.
Hi, good morning. This is Mary Ann Monroe, and thank you for this morning's session. When you were talking about CX maturity a few slides ago, I was wondering, just in your experience, or maybe anybody else on the call with your background, getting through those stages of getting established, and then, you know, moving to the wider perspective, and then you're really embedding CX into the culture, and you're a well-oiled machine. How long has that taken you and the organizations you've worked? I'm starting from the ground up. I'll give you that background in my new company and in my new job. So any thoughts would be appreciated.
Oh, well, thank you, Mary Ann.
Go first, and I'll say something as well.
Yeah, so thank you, Mary Ann, for the question. Like most things, the true answer is it varies. What I would tell you is that what drives that timeline, and frankly, whether or not it ever sticks, is really that executive sponsorship. So I worked years ago with an organization whose CEO was one of the most customer-focused CEOs I've ever witnessed. He didn't ever talk, and I'm talking when he would talk to investor groups on their investor day sessions, he was so passionate about customers. He was the main user of the data that we were generating, and he would never think of visiting a customer without having looked at all the customer feedback data so that he could be prepared. That was a company that really thrived, and because of his leadership, it was not a heavy lift to get from the left side of the screen to the, you know, embedded CX side of the screen. There have been other organizations where this tends to be a little bit more of a grassroots exercise, where you have to do a little bit more missionary work in bringing the executives along. That's going to take a longer time, you know, particularly from a funding perspective, resourcing, that sort of thing. But if you've got that executive sponsorship and that the fire in the belly of the execs, you're off to a really great start.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Valerie, your thoughts?
I'm talking away on mute. Yeah, so I totally agree. You know, it depends. The one critical factor is, and it doesn't always have to be the CEO. You need a sponsor that gets everybody's attention. So in your case, maybe it's an influencer that has power in the organization of getting everybody to say, oh, this comes from them, right? So it's not necessarily always hierarchical, but it really does require everybody supporting it, not giving it lip service. And as you all know, people do what they're paid for. So the sooner you can get HR on board and having metrics around, even if they're MBOs, you know, around being customer centric and having the culture be customer first or whatever, that really drives things. So, you know, takes a while to trickle down to get people to be paid for being customer centric or being coached for that. But that's your ultimate goal, right? Because then you know that you're serious about doing it. And Mark, you can probably, and anybody else who's had a successful group here, um, like you can see is that if the executives are just giving this lip service, then it's going to be a heavy slog. If they're actually interested and you've shown them, you've done your right cultural transformation with them, you've shown them that this is where the money's at, that they can be more competitive if you've got a product that's more generic, or that you can retain more not only customers but employees, and it saves you money, then you get their attention. And that's a piece that I have seen lacking in the CXPA exam blueprint, as I mentioned earlier, is that what's in it for me has to be continuously preached, as Mark said, because you know, it gets, you know, the covered up by the urgent instead of the long-term vision.
Thank you, Valerie.
That's my 2 cents. Show me the money, right? People very rarely say, I don't want to do it if it shows them how they're either making or saving money.
Yeah, when the whole customer experience, and this goes back to the days of even customer satisfaction, we're talking, you know, probably early 80s, executives were willing to buy this on the premise that, you know, if we treat our customers right, it just kind of makes sense that, you know, good things will happen. Executives aren't buying on faith anymore. They have to buy, you know, they need to see the proof. And so that's why I think that was really Harley Manning's main point is, you know, we have to hold ourselves to account on that. So let's jump into the questions. And number one, describing why the transformation will benefit employees directly can help them change, even though A, humans are intellectually inferior to change. B, humans are hardwired to be resistant to change. C, humans are socially offended by change. Or D, humans are culturally resistant to change. And I'm going to try to see if I can pull up so I can see the chat, so I can see answers that are coming through. They seem to be...
Yep, mostly B's.
Mostly B's, and
Yep.
in fact, that's correct. We had some in yesterday's that said, well, is this a cultural issue? And the nuance here is when we're talking cultures exist within humans, the way I read this was humans relative to what? You know, so it's really the idea that we are culturally hardwired to be resistant to change. Question 2, which of the following is your social radar and is part of your emotional intelligence? A, empathy, B, sympathy, C, apathy, or D, myopathy? And Valerie, let me know when we should show the answer. And
Sure. We're getting A. Show the answer.
And you nailed it. Empathy. Oftentimes we confuse empathy and sympathy. Empathy is is understanding the feelings of someone else. Sympathy is really having a, I struggled on this definition yesterday. Empathy is all about feeling, being able to put yourself in the other person's shoes. Question 3, where should companies who wish to fill the gap between a customer-centric culture and customer perception focus? A, changing the thinking habits and behaviors of customers. B, beginning with employees and then proceeding to the executive level. C, changing the thinking habits and behaviors of internal stakeholders. Or D, beginning with customers, then proceeding to the employees.
We're getting a little variation here. Some B's, mostly C's, C's, C, C, C's. Okay, what's the answer?
The answer is indeed C. And when we think about it, it's often tempting to think, well, don't we want to start with the grassroots and move to the executive level? Really, again, it works best if it's more top down. And then the other is, well, isn't customer centric really starting with the customer and then proceeding with the employees? Well, ostensibly you've already, had some of that thinking and some of that analysis that says this is what we need to do to become customer centric. So it's all about the internal stakeholders. Question 4, if you want engaged employees, you need to provide them with all of the following except A, knowledge, B, skills, C, ambition, or D, training.
Okay.
And
mostly C, we have a lot of ambitious people.
And that is correct. And again, this comes back to the idea of knowledge, skills, and training. Those are things that we can provide. Ambition is an inherent, internally driven factor. Question 5, which of the following do customer experience professionals need from their executives? A, finances, B, vision, C, commitment, D, all of the above.
This is a tough one.
I think it's a little more controversial.
It is.
Shall we show the answer?
Yeah.
So according to the answer given, commitment, and so that's the test answer. The Radican answer is it's really all of the above. I would agree with C being the answer if we said, which of the following do customer experience professionals need most from their executives? Because the reality is that you need vision and finances as well. But I think it starts with a commitment. So that's in part why you only need to score 80% to pass, because there will be some of those. It's a tricky exam. Which of the following best describes a moment of truth during a customer interaction? Building a customer-centric environment, creating a transparency throughout a company, fixing a customer's low priority problem, or meeting the satisfaction when a customer's expectation is highest.
Well, I'm going to steal this definition.
So how are we looking on answers, Valor?
Okay, D, question mark.
This is a smart group.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You're doing even better than yesterday.
Yeah, and yesterday did great. So one might say, well, why wouldn't fixing a customer's low priority problem, why wouldn't that kind of define a moment of truth? Well, it's all about, it's a low priority from the customer's perspective. The moment of truth is all about delivering on what the customer is looking for and what they find important. Mm-hmm. Question 7, all the following are principles put into practice in an organization to improve the customer experience, except A, offering talking points, B, listen to your employees and act on their feedback, C, hire for attitude, not aptitude, and D, give people purpose, not rules.
Okay.
The answer here is offering talking points. All the other factors are really about how you build an engaged, enlightened employee base. Talking points are really just, here's what we want you to say. and you can teach a robot to do that. Really what you're trying to do is you're trying to give your employees the guidelines and then have the trust that they will understand how to act. Question 8, implementing tools that provide a 360-degree view of customers include gaining an understanding of all except A, customer behaviors, B, customer information, C, customer preferences, D, customer recruitment. And what kind of answers are we seeing, Valerie?
D.
In fact, that is correct. Again, preferences, information, behaviors. This is all about the idea of bringing disparate sources of data as well as a number of sources of data together to have a more fully all-encompassing view of the customer. Question 9, employees surrounded by coworkers delivering substandard customer experiences will most likely do what? A, lower her standards of delivery. B, not change her standards of delivery. C, raise her standards of delivery. D, request a promotion or raise.
Oh, I vote for that. Oh, not.
And how are we looking?
D, B, A, C. We have
so
we have letter salad.
Yes, we've got some variants. The answer here, this is a variation on the principle of congruence. Yep. So what invariably happens is it's kind of the classic idea of regression to the mean. The person will lower the standards of delivery. Now, I would argue that that is what happens in the short run. If you have an inherently customer-focused person who's working in this kind of environment, he or she may lower the standards of delivery in the short run. Ultimately, they're going to leave that organization because it's not a good fit for them. Question 10, all the following can be learned from an insurance company with a successful customer-centric e-business strategy, except A, build a closed-loop system to join data across services, marketing, and claims. B, introduce technological barriers that control customer data flow. C, serve customers through their preferred medium of communication. Or D, provide an online claims status tracking.
B.
And that is correct. Now, I point out here that you're seeing, I've added a number of questions where it's like, tell me the outlier. Oftentimes you'll see a question that is worded in the negative. And I will tell you, when I was looking at these questions and picking the questions, this is one I got wrong because I glossed over the idea of barriers. I was looking at controlling data flow and technology. Be certain to read carefully. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a bit with some of my tips and tricks. Question 11, which of the following is not necessary to creating and sustaining a customer-centric culture? A, secure executive support. B, change all marketing material. C, create a shared understanding of the intended experience. Or D, build a customer experience team accountable to lead the transformation.
B, not getting, everyone's kind of slow here. Change all marketing material, B.
And that is in fact correct. So this isn't necessary to create and sustain a customer-centric culture. It may be something that could be an outcome of creating and sustaining a customer-centric culture. Interestingly, I think sometimes companies think that if we just, if we change that, we start talking differently, things will magically happen. These other elements are far more impactful. And our last question, the best employee recognition programs use a combination of formal and informal approaches to balance feedback from leaders, B, peers, C, customers, D, all of the above. And that is correct. And we had a bit of a conversation yesterday, is there ever a case when all of the above isn't right? Well, we had one earlier where it wasn't, but there are some times I recall on the exam where there are some that it's a little tricky. So let me end with giving some rather unsolicited advice. First and foremost, you can do this. I mean, I've done it, so clearly you can do it. And one of the indicators is your participation in this group and the work that you're putting into it is a good indicator of desire. So you can pass this. If you don't pass it on the first try, don't lose heart. I have heard a number of people who have had to take it a couple of times. And part of the reason
Interestingly enough, someone who actually runs a training organization, who will name this, it's not me, I got lucky on the first try, had to take it 3 times because he knew so much. Wow. Well, there's as you're going to say in a minute, overthinking and knowing so much is not necessarily a benefit.
Right. The test can be a bit tricky. I mean, it's designed, frankly, it shouldn't be a slam dunk. We really want the designation to be a bit of a challenge. However, I'm a liberal arts major. I'm a product of a liberal arts environment, which means I can write 4 pages on any topic pretty much that you can throw at me, but give me a multiple choice test and I break out in hives. So I was very nervous to come into this 100-point test where I couldn't defend my answers. But I will tell you, here are some things that I found that worked. And so use these if you like. First of all, take your time. Pace yourself, but don't rush. It is a timed exam, and it will tell you how much time you got. Just go in knowing 100 questions, this amount of time, I've got about this much time per question. There's some that are going to be slam dunks, and you can move on. There are going to be others that you might have to take more time. Secondly, read each question very carefully and really understand what it is that it's asking. And the reason for that comes in point number 3. Most of the time it's kind of like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. You can generally get 2 of the options knocked out pretty quickly, but oftentimes there'll be a subtle nuance between the last 2 that you really need to think through. So reading the question carefully and being mindful of that will help. At the same time, resist the temptation to overly obsess.
Oh no.
The way, yeah, I know. The way the exam is set up, at least the facility where I took it, you could mark the questions that you answered that you didn't quite feel very good about, or the ones that you skipped, so that when you finish, you can go back and take a look at those. Strongly recommend that you use that feature. But once you're finished, if you've got time left, I would really resist the temptation to go back and start poring over it. But do use that feature in the exam. And then we've said this, I think, throughout, and Valerie, I know you've talked about a number of the providers out there, but prep courses can be a great help. I strongly recommend that you look at Michael Bartlett's site, ccxpexamsimulator.com, and his book that's on Amazon, CCXP Exam Preparation. That book is less than $15, I think, and it's got some test questions. It talks about each section. His website has a simulator that looks very similar to what you will experience when you take the exam, including being able to mark the ones that you're not comfortable with. It's a timed exam. He offers you 2 exams in that. One is kind of your baseline. It then uses your answers and where you struggled to provide very detailed recommendations on things you might want to read, or blog posts or videos to review, or books and whatnot, to help in your preparation. And he also provides a prediction on what your test score would be based on your performance. And I will tell you that the exam nailed mine within 2 points. And I think my experience has been very common from what I've heard. So I don't work for Michael. I don't get anything. I'm just a very satisfied. I'm a huge promoter. The other thing, Michael, all the proceeds from his work in this area goes to animal rescue. So you'll often see, if you follow him on LinkedIn, you'll see from time to time animals that he's been able to save as a result of the proceeds from his book sales and the funds that come from the exam simulator. He also has a YouTube channel that has a lot of good free content. I think he's doing kind of a monthly test tip. And so I've got that out there, and you'll have access to this deck after. But strongly recommend Michael's work. And he was very helpful as I was prepping for this, because you have to kind of go back and rethink some of this. And he was very helpful in my prep as well. That's what I've got. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. I know we've got about 5 minutes left. Alternatively, like I said, you'll have access to this. We'll make the deck available with the answers
and the video, both of them.
And the video, and obviously you'll have my contact information. If you have any questions or want to reach out in any way, I'm happy to help. Valerie, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Again, an excellent presentation, lots of good questions, great session. And this is the last session. So we'd be really thrilled to hear how you did on the test as you went through. Keep up with all of us because we're now family. And I sent an email with a quick survey so that should I ever be insane enough to want to do a study group about anything else, we'd be interested in what you'd want it to be at, and if you're interested in one. And I also put a link into the chat. The Charlotte chapter is doing a session on Tuesday late afternoon, early evening on how to run, I'll call it an Agile CX workshop. And what we're going to do actually is I get to do the facilitation of this, but we're going to actually run you through an actual workshop. So you're going to come in. I might put something up on the Suite CX so that you can come in and do sticky notes and make it a bit of fun. But I'm going to give tips and techniques of how to do this virtually. Not that everybody hasn't gotten really expert of it in the time of COVID, but we thought it would be kind of fun to do that. So I sent a link. If you would register, then the Shelley and Julie, the two leads of the Charlotte chapter, would appreciate. But we just decided to open it up a little bit for anyone who's interested. So again, thank you so much. Everything's over on the peer-to-peer network, and this has been a ton of fun. And for any of you who are of my faith, Happy New Year. May it be sweet and may it improve and be good. Okay? Bye all. Thanks a ton.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.